spotlight.
Yeah. Okay. Shall I start, Vim? Are you Vimlachita?
You are spotlit as far as I know. I think Vimlachita might still have hers set to gallery view, but you are.
Okay. Okay. Great. So thanks very much, Vimlachita. Yeah, lovely introduction. And yeah, also to Kamini, beautiful meditation. Yeah, so I'm your finale for your 3 years. Which is a very nice role to have. Yeah, and I'm really delighted to join you. I've heard a lot about the Stroud Sangha, and some of you I've met, and some of you I haven't met, but yeah, I'm really glad to be joining you. And yeah, this evening, well, it's my pleasure to talk a bit about Dogen. I know you've been looking at the refuge tree, and Dogen is one of the figures on the tree. And well, first of all, I was thinking, well, why am I particularly talking about Dogen? Why me particularly? Well, I was thinking back to my early days, actually, of being involved, and I did quite a lot of retreats that were led by an order member who was then the chair of the Buddhist Centre in London, Dharmarati. And I feel really fortunate, actually, that I learned a lot of my Dharma from Dharmarati. I think he led my first couple of long retreats. But one thing that really struck me about him was he often used Zen poems and stories to illustrate the Dharma. And for me, it really brought the Dharma alive in a very direct way. So yeah, I just really, really appreciated that, the images. I love Zen poetry. I love how it's distilled, how it's all this experience distilled into just a few lines. And Zen poetry, for me, really evokes beauty and possibility. And also, it really evokes impermanence, doesn't it? And the sort of frailty of life and all earthly things. So it does all of that. And then I was thinking, well, a few years later, when I was also on another retreat with Dharmarati, Vimlachita was co-leading with him. And I think I was the organizer. I organized a lot of Vimlachita's retreats. And when she lived in London, when she worked in London. And yeah, we were in an old school. So we often hired these old schools. I can't remember which one it was now, but basically this old school had a pond, you know, which during the day just, well, it didn't look very much, to be honest. You know, it was a small pond in a school. But after a few days of being on retreat and, you know, just starting to connect more deeply with myself and the Dharma and the people around me, I came out of a ritual one evening and I went to sit near this pond. And the moon was out and the stars were out and the trees around the pond looked really beautiful. The pond itself looked really beautiful, and I felt like I was living in a Zen poem. And yeah, those things have sort of stayed with me, really. And I think I've always had or felt quite a connection with the Zen tradition. So yeah, so it was great for me to be able to look a bit more into Dogen. So Dogen, I'll tell you a bit about his life first of all, and then I'll draw out some of the teachings that he gave us left, if you like, as a kind of legacy, really. Ones that I really like, and maybe say a bit about why they appeal to me. So actually, I'm just going to turn my light on so I can see a little bit better. and hopefully see all of you a little bit better too. That's good. So Dogen, well, he was born, his dates are 12 in the 12th century till 1253. So, and he's often known as the sort of de facto founder of Soto Zen, which is a more silent, contemplative aspect of Zen with lots of meditation, whereas Rinzai is the other main school, and that's much more linked to koans and exploring practice through koans. So Dogen's early life, well, it was quite tragic actually. His father died when he was just 2 years old. So he was very young when his father died. And then his mother also died while he was still a boy, around the age of 7 or 8. So yeah, his early life was marked with real sense of loss. And those losses had a profound effect on him. I mean, yeah, imagine having those kind of losses at such an early age. So it's sort of said that, you know, in the grieving that he felt and in solitude, he did realize something of the frailty of earthly life and earthly things. And it's also said that he decided to become a monk when he saw the incense rising above his mother's coffin. So he must have already seen other, you know, monks and practitioners of the Dharma, and yeah, that must have had a profound effect on him. So yeah, you can already see some resonances with some of the stories you might have heard of other practitioners, like even Buddha with the loss of his mother, and you know, things he saw later in his life. So Dogen was adopted by an uncle for a while, but the uncle really wanted him to become his heir, and Dogen wasn't so interested in this. So when the time was nearing for his uncle to sort of make him his heir, he decided to leave. So he fled from his uncle's house, and he went to find another uncle, a younger uncle, who lived more as a hermit. So he had 2 uncles that were very different. One was a hermit, one was wanting him to be his heir. So yeah, very different uncles. And then he eventually joined a monastery around the age of 12 or 13. So yeah, he studied, he meditated, and the monastery was near Kyoto, which was then the capital of Japan. And yeah, I suppose another interesting thing to sort of think about around this time, I think Japan would have been a really interesting place because there were a lot of interesting teachers. So Dogen was actually a contemporary of Shinran. So Shinran has a very different approach in lots of ways, but there's also some similarities in their approach, which I guess I've learned a bit more about through reading Nagapriya's recent book, Promise of a Sacred World. And I really recommend that book, actually. There's a whole little section on Dogen and Shinran, which I found really interesting. So Shinran's dates, yeah, he was a contemporary. And then there's another quite well-known Rinzai, I suppose, founder really, called Isai. And then his successor, who was called Myozen. So all of those 4 were very important in that sort of time that Dogen was living, Dogen being one of them. So yeah, one question that Dogen had when he went off to this monastery, and which it continued to be a question for him, was, and he must have already heard some of the teachings obviously by now. Well, his question was, if all beings already possess Buddha nature, Why does one need to arouse the will to enlightenment and engage in practices to realize it? So this was his question that he had, and it felt to him like quite a compelling question. And that question, you know, led him, well, first of all, to be practicing in this particular place, but eventually, you know, it led him to China to try and find the answer to this question, but other questions that he had. And he went to China with this person that I mentioned just a minute ago, Myozen, who was going there. And when he got there, Myozen was really recognized as a monk, but Dogen wasn't. And they refused to let him in, really, to this monastery that he wanted to go to, because they said he hadn't taken the right precepts in Japan. So Dogen was at a bit of a loose end, really, you could say. And he sort of hung around in China for quite a long time. And eventually the person who was the abbot of this monastery that he'd wanted to get into actually died, and a new abbot was appointed. And this abbot was a bit more sort of open to Dogen. So Dogen was allowed to enter the monastery, but he was still not really seen as a proper monk. So he couldn't join in with quite a lot of the activities that were on. But this abbot saw his potential, I think, and so he did get invited sometimes to his quarters to discuss the Dharma, and, you know, he obviously could see his potential. So this kind of meant that there was sometimes when he was able to kind of go into the meditation hall and practice. And one day he was in the meditation hall when this particular abbot, who was called Rujing, was teaching. And he heard a teaching from him to a monk who was sleeping. And I guess they were doing long nights of meditation, lots of just sitting, you know, quite hardcore practice. So Rujing could see this monk was sleeping. So, you know, you often get quite a direct teaching, don't you, when you're practicing Zen? So he said to him, "You must drop body and mind. What use is single-minded sleeping? You must drop body and mind. What use is single-minded sleeping?" So there's a little teaching for us all. Imagine getting that, though, as like a quite powerful sort of teaching. It wouldn't have been a quiet little, it's almost like a shout, I think, in the Zen monasteries sometimes, of trying to really wake, well, this monk was literally asleep, so he was really trying to wake him up, but not just from, you know, a physical sleep. He was trying to wake him up also so that he actually became enlightened. Anyway, that particular teaching had a profound effect on Dogen, and he experienced a dropping off of his body and mind. So, you know, that teaching wasn't even meant for him, but he happened to be there, and he was the one that was affected by it. I don't know whether the other monk was affected by it or not, the one that was sleeping. Maybe he never woke up, I'm not sure. Anyway, Dogen did wake up, and eventually he received a kind of seal and a mantle of recognition from this abbot, who was called Rujing, as I mentioned earlier. And later he references Rujing as Old Buddha, which I really love. So he really saw him as like the Buddha, or the Buddha, who'd given him a really powerful teaching. So he then returns from China eventually, and He's coming back, though, empty-handed in terms of texts, in terms of sutras, in terms of sacred images, things that maybe in the past were brought back when people went to China. So he's got, in a way, he's got nothing to sort of, in some ways, show for his time in China. But he does have all this inner richness that he has been, you know, party to through coming into contact with this particular teacher, Rujing. So he has an inner richness and an inner practice which is very deep. Yeah, and I guess my sense is that then there was a period when he really wanted to really let that teaching, I guess, really become quite embedded and sort of drop more deeply into his being. So for a while he went and lived a bit more remotely, and yeah, in a smaller sort of hermitage. So he had gone back originally to his original monastery, but then he realized perhaps that he needed to go somewhere a bit smaller. And it's said that he sort of refined his ideas a little bit more, the teachings, etc. And then in 1233, he established a small centre and monastery. And then he was doing quite a lot of writing, and that's when one of his most famous books, Genjo Koan, which is a bit sometimes called his manifesto, that's when that was kind of written. And I think one thing that really strikes me is he wanted it to be something that both lay people and you know, the monks and nuns could, you know, he wanted it to be relevant to both and something that both would be able to benefit from. Yeah, and then in about 1243, he went and lived even more remotely, and he went to a province more to the north in Japan, and he founded a monastery called Eihiji, which still remains apparently the national centre for Soto Zen in Japan. So it dates right back to Dogen. And then in 1253, when he was 53, he became ill, and then he eventually died that year. So in a way, his life isn't like a long life, but he did a lot in it. And well, you can probably already see there are some kind of resonances with the Buddha's life and with other figures that you might have heard of. So there's a kind of tragedy. There's tragedies in his early life. There's also a quest, isn't there? Him going to China, and then there's, well, a kind of understanding that he has, and he really wants to share that with somebody, and share that with not just somebody, but share that with others, you know, not just one person, but lots of people. And then I guess he does a lot of writing, so he really leaves a legacy, which, given that, you know, he didn't live a long life, seems just, well, just, I'm really glad he did, basically. I mean, he wouldn't have known that, but of course that is just so important. So yeah, in David Brazier's book, The Dark Side of the Moon, he talks about Dogen's life in terms of decades. So at 13, he was ordained. At 23, he went to China. At 33, he wrote Genjo Koan. At 43, he moved to Echizen, which is the place I mentioned, the headquarters of Soto Zen. And then in 1253, he died. So he's got these sort of, every decade, something really significant in his life happens. And yeah, that's quite interesting. So, yeah. So as I said, what was happening in Japan must have been really interesting. But I'm going to take us back to the trip in China now, and this time when he was at a bit of a loose end, because I'm trying to think what that might have been like. You know, he must have felt a bit sort of, well, maybe a bit humiliated in a way. You know, he'd made that effort, he'd gone all the way there, and then actually he wasn't, you know, admitted originally, or at least initially, to the monastery. And in his book, or in his writings, the instructions to the Tenzo, which is this great sort of piece, like, what would you call it? It's not quite a book, but it's included in some of his books. And he's basically, the Tenzo would be the cook in a monastery. And the Tenzo in Japan was seen as a really important figure, and they were often a senior monk. So yeah, that their job was really, really important. And in the middle of one of his texts, the Genjo Koans, he actually does mention something from the instructions to the Tenzo. And what he mentions is this particular story when he meets somebody who is a Tenzo. And I'm just going to find it. Oh, sorry, oh, yeah, here it is. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I just lost my little piece of paper. Hang on, I will find it. Tell you what, I'm going to read it from a poem instead. So this poem is more of a contemporary poem, but it says it in quite, quite straight language. So this is a poem actually by an Australian poet called Robert Gray, and it's called To the Master Dogen Zenji. So Dogen received, they say, his first insight from the old cook of some monastery in China, who was on the jetty where they docked, who had come down to buy mushrooms among the rolled up straw sails, the fish nets, brocade litters, and geese in baskets. High sea-going junk shuffling and dipping like an official. Dogen could see an empty shoreline, the pinewood plank of the beach, the mountains, far off and dusty, standing about with his new smooth skull. And then he met this Buddhist, and the old man, this is the Tenzo, told him, up there, that place, that monastery, that's where I come from. My study is cooking. No, not devotion. No, not your sacred books. And Dogen, irate, must have thought, who is this guy so ignorant of the law? And it must have shown. Son, I regret that you haven't caught on to where it is one discovers the original nature of the mind and all things. So this Tenzo was going to buy mushrooms, and he was buying them because he wanted to give the monks mushrooms because there was a special festival. And basically Dogen didn't quite see the importance of the cooking. He just more took it as just cooking, but really for the Tenzo, cooking isn't just cooking. Cooking is cooking for the three jewels. Cooking is, in a way, cooking your life, you could say. And it's just that the mushrooms are, they're not just a practical matter. So Dogen says to him, why can't you get someone else to do that? And he says, if I don't do it, who will, kind of thing. And Dogen still doesn't quite get it. It's like he's seeing it as a chore. He's seeing it as, yeah, just, as I said, just literally preparing food. But for the Tenzo, it's a really important ritual. It's like a sort of holy duty, you could say. And yeah, why I'm really struck by this point that he includes this in the middle of quite an important text is that I guess what he's doing is he's showing himself to have got it wrong and not to have seen just the importance of the Tenzo's role and what the Tenzo was trying to kind of get at, really. So yeah. So the Tenzo's saying other people are not me. No, in a way he's saying no one can live my life for me or serve it for me. My work, my suffering, my joy. I'm taking responsibility for those. And if I don't do it now, when else can I do it? Only I can take care of these things. Only I can receive, you know, this life that I'm in. And I guess the Tenzo's practice was to take care of this, take care of that, make sure that the rice was cleaned properly, make sure that whatever needs doing was done with care and attention. And there's a kind of joy really in just doing totally what needs doing. And just engaging with it and not half doing anything. So the old Tenzo, in a way, for me, is saying, this is what it's like to live a passionate life. He's spending his life preparing food for others. Actually, we're all preparing food for others, even when we're, and the three jewels, when we're typing an email, we're preparing food for others. Someone's going to receive that email. When we're taking care of our children, we're, you know, looking out for others. When we're, you know, teaching a class, when we're sorting through a bag of stuff we might take to a charity shop, you know, we're all doing cooking, you could say. So yeah, the Tenzo's role is really important, and I guess Dogen really saw that. So he really saw that the practical matters are very, very crucial, and this life is the only life we have. And if we don't do the cooking ourselves, we're somehow not really taking responsibility for our life. And I guess the other thing that I like about all of that is, well, as Vimlachita mentioned, we worked in a restaurant together, and I also carried on working there for quite a long time. And I guess working there for me had both a sort of alchemical and a sort of transforming effect. Yeah, and at its best, my work became like an offering. There were the ingredients, the literal ingredients, but there were also the ingredients of my body, my relationships, my emotions, my thoughts, my actions were all part of those ingredients. And yeah, bringing all of that together to make something, to offer some food to the Three Jewels, to sometimes we cooked for Bante, or at least he had sometimes had our lunches. Yeah, so there's something about that that really strikes me in Dogen's teaching, something about these instructions to the Tenzo and him learning something from that. And then applying that to, I think we can apply that to all practical tasks, and, you know, why in a way there's quite an emphasis in Zen on everyday life, everyday activity. So, yeah. And the other thing in the instructions to the Tenzo is very much about doing things with three kinds of mind. So the joyful mind, the kind mind, and the great mind. So the mind that's joyful is the mind that rejoices. So yeah, cooking food as an offering to the Three Jewels, precious opportunity that we're fortunate to have. And again, you can apply that to all our activities. Then there's the kind mind that looks after everything, that does all the small tasks, whether it's washing the rice or buying the mushrooms. It's whether or not you're using grasses to make your soup, or nettles, or a fine vegan cream. So yeah, and then the great mind is the mind like a mountain or an ocean. And it's like this great shout of freedom. Yeah, so that ties in with also Dogen's teaching in China that he later had when he had this sort of sense from Rujong of this great shout. Yeah. And then I guess the other things that I really like about Dogen, a lot of the other things that I really like, is I like the fact that he he uses a lot of images, and you know, in a way you could say that a lot of the texts and the images are like codes. It's a bit like you're trying to sort out or work out a code. So there's things like the moon, and then there's things like fish in the sea and birds in the air, and there's wood, and there's ash, and there's mirrors, and there's fans, and there's stories. And but he really strikes me as not so much of a taker of a position, as more a sort of explorer. And actually, David Brazier brings that out in his book. He says Dogen it doesn't so much kind of, you know, position himself. He keeps exploring possibilities. So he opens things up, and he keeps opening them up, rather than closing them down and kind of saying, this is how it is. It's like he keeps bringing more possibilities in, or showing us more ways, trying to get us to keep looking and to keep staying curious. Yeah, and I guess I really connect with the moon image. The moon is a symbol of, it's a symbol of the light of the Dharma often in Zen poetry and in Dogen's work. And I think the moon's also like a cool beauty, isn't it? And one of the descriptions of nirvana is like a cool cave. I've always really liked that, a cool cave. Yeah, and the moon is a balm, and it's also it also has phases, so it's impermanent, and comes into fullness, and then it disappears, or seemingly disappears for a while, and then it comes back into fullness, doesn't it, depending where you are in the world. Yeah, but it's also said that when body and mind do fall away, the moon lodges within. Well, there's that possibility of the moon lodging within. So it's the Dharma then lodging within us, which yeah, is really beautiful, I think. And also in this book, which is by David Brazier, which again I really recommend, it's called The Dark Side of the Mirror. And I have read it, and as soon as I read it, I thought I need to read that again straight away, because it's got so much in it, so many different things. But one of the things that I really like in it, again, are these images, but one of them in particular, he talks quite a bit about well, turning off our own, or making our own sort of self dark, so that the light of the Buddha and the Buddhas can actually shine. And he uses this lovely analogy of when we've got a light on in our room and the moon's outside, our light somehow means that the light of the moon doesn't really shine in as fully. But if I turn my light out, if there was a moon out there, it would be shining more now, but there isn't. So you're not going to see the moon, but you might it's just a different kind of possibility, because as soon as we turn our own light out, the light of the Dharma can sort of shine more brightly. So it's a kind of, it's not sort of, it's almost a bit sort of self-effacing in a positive sense, you know, you could say. And yeah, the image really speaks to me about how to work with sort of forgetting the self a bit as well, because that's another thing that Dogen talks about. To study the self, you know, is to forget the self. And yeah, something about this image of the moon and the dark really, for me, resonates. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I'm just in a way giving you a bit of a taste of Dogen. There's so many things I could say, but there's also, I thought I might read a couple of his short poems, because a lot of his texts are quite quite hard to understand if you just get a little section. So let's find one of his poems. So here's one of his poems. Awake or asleep, in a grass hut, what I pray for is to bring others across before myself. A snowy heron on the snow field, where winter grass is unseen, hides itself in its own figure. And then, given to a Zen person who requested a poem, mind itself is Buddha. Practice is difficult. Explanation is not difficult. Not mind, not Buddha. Explanation is difficult. Practice is not difficult. And then I discovered that Dogen really inspired Ryokan, and Ryokan's another favourite Zen poet of mine. And yeah, I found this lovely poem that Ryokan wrote called Reading the Record of Iha Dogen. Yeah, and it's just he's just in a way just talking about finding this book and how it's all been kind of covered up in, you know, a bit sort of covered with dust, just because no one has had an eye for recognizing the Dharma. And yeah, he just gets quite moved by that. I'm not going to read the whole poem because it's a bit long, but yeah, there's something about him coming across Dogen's teaching and being moved by it and realizing that, yeah, it's gathering dust. So yeah, it's very beautiful. And I can imagine Ryokan sitting in his thatched hut, trying to read and also feeling really strongly for Dogen. Yeah, and I guess a lot of his teaching did go a bit into, it sort of fell, well, people didn't know about it. And then, yeah, people like Ryokan drew it out again. And then finally, I thought I would, well, give you a direct transmission. But it's an imaginary one. So you probably know, and I haven't said loads about this because that's the whole other talk, but you probably know about the story of the Buddha holding up a flower and to Kassapa, and Kassapa recognizing the flower. So you'll know that story, I imagine, most of you. No? Okay, well, there's a story where the Buddha, you know, has done lots of teaching, and then eventually holds up a flower, and only one person in the whole assembly understand and smile, and the Buddha sees that, and you know, it's like a direct transmission. So my direct transmission to you is, I'm holding something up, it's round, it gleams with light. It's not in the sky tonight, but you've got to imagine it's here, and I'm just holding it up to you. It's in my hands. Can you see it?
Nearly there. Would you like to unrecord now, Bodhi?